I'm going to have a presentation that's going to be me reading from, well, talking a bit and then reading some, kind of going back and forth. I'm kind of cobbling together text and notes from a few different projects that I'm working on, but I hopefully it comes together in some form of knot that I find myself working through in my own research and practice. Sorry, I'll speak. Yeah. I'm not very good at projecting, but I'll try. So it really has to do with this sort of strange hybrid space that I find myself in my own research, sort of operating in this world between philosophy and design research and practice. And I find myself working in this area increasingly in my own writing, but also in the kind of practice that I do at Arizona State University. And I also direct the Laboratory for Critical Techniques there, which is a sort of speculative design philosophy research space. And I'm really, what I'm interested in is how it is that that philosophy and design research might find common ground in something like speculation, where speculation might be something that both philosophy and design have a particular kind of concern for, and they can actually mutually transform each other. But what I've increasingly come to realize is that it will require, I think, or does require a kind of transformation on both ends, more of a transversal relationship where they both become transformed through the relationship. And I kind of want to, right now, I want to rehearse I'm going to try to construct a kind of argument here to allow the knot to unfold, as it were. And well, depending on the time, I might offer some reflections on how I think we could move it forward. If we don't have the time, I might just leave it open-ended. On the one hand, I really want to think about speculation as a struggle. And a particular kind of risk, and something that's not actually easily achieved. In other words, there are no, well, I want to read a quote from you, actually, because Whitehead talks, I mean, we've talked a lot about the proposition, and Whitehead talks very specifically about the speculative proposition, and what would be entailed for the speculative proposition. And there are different kinds of propositions for Whitehead, of course, right? And he says on page, I wrote this quote down, 197 of Process and Reality, for a speculative proposition, the proposition must have a uniform truth value, in the sense that by reason of its form and scope, its truth value is identical with the truth value of each of its singular propositions, to be obtained by restricting the application of the predicate to any one set of logical subjects, end quote. Whitehead, and this is the way I'm taking Whitehead, and this is my own sort of reading of Whitehead here, is that Whitehead is talking about the demanding task of staging a scene in which we would have to account for how the proposed world, in other words, these predicates that we're entertaining in a speculative proposition, how the proposed world matters to each and every logical subject, right? And that is an incredibly demanding task. And this is one of the things that concerns me, and how there are no pre-given tools, techniques, or specializations, or expertise or professionalizations that prepare one for making a speculative proposition. In other words, we don't know where they're going to come from. This is why I really was moved by Brianne's presentation, because I thought that was particularly poignant, where you might not quite know how it is something is going to lure you into thinking and feeling in a speculative way. So I'm reminded here also of Whitehead's critique of the professional in science and modern world, and I want to read a little bit here from a paper about. When Whitehead wrote about professionalization in science in the modern world, he was criticizing the 19th century, quote, discovery of the method of training professionals, who specialize in particular regions of thought and thereby progressively add to the sum total or sum of knowledge within their respective limitation of subject, or respective limitation of subject, end quote. That's from 196 of Science and the Modern World. What worried Whitehead was the devastating effect of modern professionalism. It produced, as he says, minds in a groove, in which professionals, quote, live in contemplating a given set of abstractions. The groove presents straying across country, and the abstraction abstracts from something to which no further attention is paid, end quote. When this happens, thinking loses its hold on the complex environmental coordination required for a specific set of abstractions to exist in the first place. Well, there's little doubt that some form of specialized or expertise, specialized knowledge or expertise is important for speculation. I think it is just as important not to overestimate expertise's mode of importance for speculation. We can see why this is the case throughout Whitehead's early and mature work. For example, when he wrote The Concept of Nature in 1920, several years before the publication of Process and Reality, he sought, as he says, to construct a speculative concept of nature that would pay due attention to all of what we are aware of in perception, from the scientist's interpretation of the sunset in terms of electromagnetic waves to the poet's description of its beauty. It's crucial not to mistake Whitehead's proposition for one that endeavors to provide an exhaustive account of nature or even perception. Rather, and much more humbly, he wishes to offer an account of what we as situated observers are aware of in our perception of nature. This includes both expert and non-expert awareness. They must be put together in the same boat, as Whitehead says, according to sink or swim together. I'm sure you all know that quote. If we explain away either one, then we fall victim to the crippling modern habit of thought that privileges one set of experiences over another, that disregards one form of sense-making in favor of another. In doing so, we fail to pay due attention to what the situation makes matter to us, to all of what we are aware of in perception. Speculation demands that we resist the modern temptation to neglect, reduce, or explain away certain experiences in the name of a common measure that transcends them, such as expert knowledge. Speculating amounts to giving due attention to the divergences that make up our world, all the while resisting our well-worn habit of offering an account that would be able to subsume them under a concept once and for all. So I think what that quote, well, I pulled out a series of quotes, but what that helps me do is sort of start thinking about how speculation can't be guaranteed by any kind of expertise or professionalization. And that's precisely what Whitehead will say we need to guard against, are these modes of professionalization, and including professional philosophical knowledge. And what I've come to appreciate also is how, and this comes from actually an essay that Isabel Stenger's recently published, and I think it's in one of your volumes back here for one of the conferences that was held here. I've come to appreciate how the speculative proposition must also include some form of common sense, right? And this is a sort of troubling notion. And I think that in a recently published article, Stengers pays careful attention to how important common sense is to Whitehead's speculative philosophy. Stengers is not speaking, of course, about Deleuze's notion of common sense, the sense that is presumed to be true because it is held in common. Rather, she is talking about the necessity of, quote, and this is a quote from her, taking an interest in the way others make their world matter, including animals and other living and non-living systems. The idea here is paying attention to what matters in a situation means accepting that there are radically different ways of having a situation matter. And these differences cannot be explained away or accounted for in advance. In other words, the common sense of a situation expresses the divergent ways a situation makes sense. And I actually think this gives us some context, and this requires a much larger conversation, but it gives some context for why it is Isabel Stengers will say, drawing heavily on Whitehead, that speculative propositions are actually, we encounter them in user communities, extreme user communities, and activist communities, and even among neo-pagan witches. That we have these kinds of propositions that activate a particular kind of speculative thought. And it's not happening among modern professional philosophers necessarily, right? That we can actually that they are incredibly important for putting our own modern habits of thought at risk, recognizing the limitations of them, and so forth. And for me, this brings me actually to my interest in design research, because I've become particularly interested in the last 7 or 8 years in how it is we can construct speculative propositions outside of the text, outside of language, necessarily communicated language among humans, linguistic propositions. And how they might be forged through practice, thinking with physical objects, thinking with technologies, and different kinds of collectives and organizations and so forth. And as some of you may know, design research itself has been infected, I like to say, with the speculative bug. It is kind of like speculative design is a bit like a virus that has sort of infected the design research world. We see it happening within, I just name a few of the areas, the traditional design disciplines such as architecture, industrial design, graphic design, interior design, but also then we have this sort of spawn of new fields that have been born out of speculative design, such as adversarial design, discursive design, design for debate, design fiction. These are all fields of design that are fundamentally interested in critiquing the values that we hold for design and physical objects today, right? Sort of neoliberal values. I mean, this is actually fundamentally invested in a lot of it, especially adversarial design and properly construed speculative design. Interested in the critique of the commercialism of design, and also at the same time proposing different kinds of futures, right? Alternative futures and futures that we might not even design. They're prototyped. They're fundamentally prototyped. And one of the ways I've talked about this is that the way speculative design, I think it's in its best version, tends to function today, is both through critique and construction, right? And you can obviously see the sort of Deleuzian resonances here. You get critique and construction going together. They never go without that sort of pair. And this sounds, in some ways, like a perfect match for the kind of work that I'm interested in, right? But I think, and this is the trouble, is that I think we need to be very wary about speculation in design, and we need to push it, just as we need to push philosophy outside of the linguistic realm, and we need to start thinking about how we might formulate speculative propositions and practices with materials and collectivity and so forth, like we're doing here today and yesterday as well. I think we also need to be wary of just how easy speculation is deployed within practices, and that make it their explicit problem to become speculative. And I worry about this precisely because speculation becomes professionalized. And you can see, obviously, them coming back together with Whitehead. And so bringing together speculation and design has risks of its own. And I want to read a little bit to sort of lay out this context for you, and I probably will leave it as a cliffhanger to see how we can put it back together. Let's see. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit here. So in commenting on the many fictional products and services, if any of you are familiar with speculative design, that is sort of the field, is that they're producing fictional products and services and imagining scenarios and so forth. But in commenting on the many fictional products and services that come out of speculative design practices, Jonathan Lucan and Carl DeSalvo insist that they all require technical fluency in order to be imagined and built. They suggest that this is a defining feature of speculative design, and it is one that sets it apart from certain species of design fiction and other forms of design that are actually more interested in narrative and discursive formations. So fluency, however, is not the same as literacy. Where the latter entails nothing more than a rote application, fluency, by contrast, is, quote, the ability to be creative with technology, the capability to understand, use, and access technology. It is to be able to write poetry with it, instead of just read, write, and speak it. Speculative design, I'm tempted to suggest, and this is me, might then be a kind of technical poetics, which manages to explore the possibility space of our current technical condition. Speculative design, Lucans and DeSalvo continue, is a, quote, exploration of the space of possibilities created by technology, a space that can be imagined only by the technologically fluent, end quote. And indeed, we can see this commitment to some modality of technical poetics operating across the wide range of work that qualifies either explicitly or implicitly as speculative design. From the work of Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby, who are definitely some of the most prominent speculative designers, Bill Gaver, Natalie Jeremenchenko, Carl DeSalvo, as well as the design research on biotechnology and synthetic biology happening at the MIT Media Lab right now, and so on and so forth. And I go on to detail all those sorts of projects. But anyways, of course, what I go on to suggest is that there's an important presumption in all of this concerning the fact that speculative design addresses itself only to our technological present and future. In other words, this form of design is about technology. For designers like DeSalvo and Lukens, my sense is that they have modern industrial and communication technologies in mind, but I think we could safely broaden this understanding and claim without too much difficulty that speculative design, as it tends to be practiced today, demands fluency in any modern technique, which is to say any practice that requires skill or technique in order to bring something into being. And this includes everything from software development to ritualistic spell casting by neo-pagan witches. Put in this frame, I think there's a more serious presumption in all this, and it has to do with fluency and mastery. I'll return to this presumption momentarily, but before I do so, I want to shift gears in order to ask a very simple but necessary question. Why is speculative design making such a splash today? Why, after being wedded to commercialism for decades, do designers feel the need or the urge to resurrect the spirit of earlier design studios such as Super Studio from the 1960s, who were very famous for their paper architecture and doing speculative design and so forth? And at such an alarming rate. Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby, along with Carol DeSalvo and a host of other designers, provide a fairly straightforward and instructive answer to this. We need it more than ever. For their part, Dunn and Raby argue that after the financial crisis of 2008, there was an unbelievable demand for thinking about alternatives to capitalism, alternatives to the failed neoliberal project, and so alternatives to how design might function within society. If design found itself wedded to commercialism or consumerism in the 1980s, primarily because there seemed no viable alternatives to the global spread of capitalism, then one upshot of 2008 is that it opened up the possibility for a different future, or in any case, the need to think it. Could design research, many began to ask, be used to propose non-consumer futures? Could it be used to generate alternative ways of being with technical objects, for example? In saying this, I don't want to make the strong claim that speculative design has a coherent political agenda. While the prominent design studies scholar Tony Fry boldly asserts that design is the condition on which we can re-envision the political in strong battalion sense, the political of the political. Speculative design makes no such assertion. There is certainly no unified political project for speculative designers. Rather, the claim I want to make is more subtle than this, and that is speculation's emergence within design fields is a result of an evolving set of political and economic conditions that make it possible for designers to entertain values for technology that appear to conflict or directly contest capital. It is within this framework that the large-scale adoption of a technical poetics in design is even conceivable. It is also in this context that such a high premium is placed on the imagination. If some form of fluency is a precondition for speculation, then this is because it activates the imagination. The imagination, right, Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby, quote, gives us entry to abstraction. We gain the ability to conceive of alternatives. We gain the ability to think of futures and outcomes, skills of planning. The ability to think ethically also becomes a possibility, end quote. In short, quote, designers need to shift from designing applications to designing implications by creating imaginary products and services that situate these new developments within everyday material culture. Quote, end quote. Similarly, Julian Bleecker writes that, quote, design fiction and speculative design more generally is a way of exploring different approaches to making things, probing the material conclusions of your imagination, removing the usual constraints when designing for massive market commercialization. This opens people up to a different kind of design. Excuse me, it's a little clunky. Anyways, and then Dunn and Raby go on to say, rather than giving up altogether, there are other possibilities for design. One is to use design as a means for speculating about how things could be. This form of design thrives on imagination and aims to open up new perspectives. Given these bold and unquestionably optimistic theses, there should also be little doubt that the imagination seems to have sort of quasi-redemptive power for speculative future design. It is the faculty capable of saving us from the present. It is in this way that design is also an ethical political practice. Human imagination bears the ethical responsibility of discovering alternatives to the failed neoliberal project. And if this task does not seem Sisyphean, and there is moreover a lightness and optimism to so much of this work, then it is because there's little doubt that viable alternatives exist. They're just waiting for the designer's imagination to discover them. We should therefore trust the goodwill of the designer. It is the goodwill of her imagination, activated through technical fluency, that we should entrust to save us from our inherently myopic view of the techno-capitalist present. Gilles Deleuze, of course, thought about the goodwill in a slightly different way in Difference and Repetition. There, he urged us to be skeptical of our eagerness to put such faith in the goodwill of others. Historically, the goodwill is aligned to truth and understanding. It is the inherent goodwill of thought that works against the forces of difference and chaos. It is the supposition of a goodwill that makes us believe that the faculties are properly ordered in Kant's sense when they align on a self-same object. Under these conditions, there is a common sense among the faculties, which are all in the service of some truth. I think that there is a similar understanding of goodwill and common sense underpinning much of what passes for futures-oriented speculative design today. Only now, designers require a proper ordering of the faculty of imagination in relation to the other faculties, so that technical fluency can emerge and activate different possibilities for design. I'm going to skip through this really quick. You're quite over. Am I quite over? Yeah. Okay. Can I get to the punchline real quick? All right. The punchline is this. So, given that the imagination is now entrusted to do the work or labor of finding an alternative technological futures, suggests a certain alignment, perhaps, with the autonomous tradition of Marxism. In the autonomous perspective, labor and capital are external to one another, and for this reason, we might be inclined to think that the design imagination labors to perturb capitalist expansion. However, and in keeping with the autonomous framework, I think we're actually confronted, if obliquely at first, with what the political philosopher Maurizio Lazzarato claims is the most generalized form of today's power relationship, namely the debtor-creditor relationship. Revising Michel Foucault's important analysis of human capital and the entrepreneurial self, Lazzarato contends that the emergence of the enterprising self also entails a completely new regime of power, which is characterized by a new technology of government, namely debt. And this is not debt understood merely in economic terms. And basically what I go on to say is that I want to bring the image of thought proposed by future-oriented speculative design and the internalization of the debt economy. Such a perspective invites us to ask whether the faith designers place in the imagination for creating a new and better future is not just the very specific way that designers assume responsibility for the failures of the system, for the failures that must now be explicitly assumed by individuals. And it's their expertise, their imaginative expertise, that actually imagines these other, we're basically carrying the debt through our imagination. And so I sort of finish by saying that using futures design as our case study, we might complement Lazzarato's understanding of the debt economy with the theory of the imagination economy. In such an economy, futures design is not antithetical to commercial design or the design thinking industry. It's simply a way of designers internalizing the guilt they feel for a hopeless industry and then using the imagination to pay off a debt that is ultimately unpayable. It's kind of bleak, but that's where I finish. I'll finish today. But my hope is that we can actually pair together something that looks a little bit less like the expertise, the technical expertise and the imagination that's involved in speculative design with something like a kind of speculative practice that wouldn't involve expertise, or rather that would take expertise as only one way that a situation comes to matter, that would involve the divergence of other perspectives. And how do we actually design a practice, a speculative practice, that would account for those other perspectives? So, thank you.
We have a little bit of time for discussion.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
You want to jump in? Yep.
All right. Hello. Do you mind if I just take you back to the very start and just make a comment?
Mm-hmm.
we learned about propositions yesterday. We're going to learn more about propositions later. Whitehead starts Process and Reality by saying one of the points of this book is to be against the subject-predicate way of thinking. Then the quotation you bring up, which is if you read the section on propositions, then suddenly he's talking about logical subjects and complex predicates. And I only want to bring it up as I think we should be a little bit more surprised and unsure of what's going on, given that he's now reintroduced them in exactly the heart of propositions, which we're dealing with over a couple of days. I mean, if you can comment on it if you like.
No, I think you're absolutely right, but I also think you have to keep in mind that he has his own work with Russell in mind, right? The bivalent logic that he was using previously is exactly what he's trying to I think, he's trying to play with the subject-predicate logic, but he's also using it in a very different way than he did with Russell.
No, I think you're exactly right. It's actually, we can situate Whitehead's metaphysics, not thinking that it comes out of nowhere.
Right.
It comes out of his Principia Mathematica, the fact that Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, who he worked with, is just stuff full of propositions. And it's almost like he's saying, these analytic philosophers, I'm not letting them get away with these propositions.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Everything he says in Principia Mathematica, he can accommodate within Process and Reality, but say more.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean,
I think we should pay attention. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, Adam, if you can, I know you will rush in at the end, but I'm just wondering if you can unpack or speak to a bit more what you're doing there with the speculative design and the debtor-creditor relationship.
Right.
Because the making of the indebted man is, as far as I'm concerned, an extraordinary book.
Right.
I can't quite see what you're doing.
Right. Given more time, I would. So that's why I said I guess I would leave it as a cliffhanger, because it's like, hey, what am I going to do?
I'm on the edge of my seat.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think what one of the ways that I'm critiquing the use of speculation in speculative design practices today, and whether they're explicitly or implicitly speculative design practices, is the professionalization of the use of speculation. That basically through some form of technical fluency, we can access an imaginative alternative to what it is, that any given object can be used for, right? Because, speculative designers are famous for, taking everyday objects and then transforming them into these very weird things and putting them in scenarios that you would never even recognize them anymore, right? But, by and large, the argument is that comes through a particular kind of fluency, right? It comes through a kind of professionalization, I would argue, of how we think about technical objects, right? So I think somebody like Isabel Stengers is a perfect person to think with this or alongside of this, precisely because she's not privileging the professional. In fact, she critiques the professional in many ways, right? And she wants to say that if we're thinking about, talks about the GMO event in Europe, for example, right? It's not the scientists who we should be trusting, right? She talks about Barbara Van Dyke, and I've written about Barbara Van Dyke before, and she talks about her as, she was a scientist, but actually she was protesting from her stance as a citizen, right? As an informed citizen, right? And that those are the kinds of divergent views that we actually have to be able to accommodate in design practice. That it can't just be that, the person who knows how to play with Arduino can actually make speculative propositions about what technology is about. Like, I'm scared when it's only, the technocrats that tell me about technology. So, I think that's the space that a new kind of speculative design needs to intervene, and that we wouldn't actually be just seeing, that, oh my gosh, we need to train ourselves and become technologically fluent, because that's actually what's going to save us from our relationship to the earth, our failed neoliberal project, and so forth. That's kind of, if that makes sense, that's kind of how I'm trying to piece them together eventually.
I'm not sure, I don't get it how that kind of breaks or interrupts or shifts the debt-based governmentality model of late neoliberalism, as Lazzarato presents it? I mean, I'm not accurate in words now.
Yeah, that's okay.
What's the, I don't get the entry point here?
So what I'm suggesting is that the imagination in speculative design functions as a form of paying off debt. So it's a critique of how,
Okay.
so if I had more time, I could talk about actually the kinds of speculative designs that are being proposed that are
Yeah.
the sort of part of the reigning discourse where, they're all generating alternatives to, well, either a failed neoliberal project or, the Anthropocene or it goes on and on. I mean, they have like designers who are using design tools to intervene in the refugee crisis in Europe, right? Now there's...
So paying off debt is because paying off debt for me is also reiterating the logic of debt.
Yes, that's the point.
It's not breaking it.
No, of course, and that's why I said it's trying to pay off an unpayable debt, right? Is that you assume the responsibility for it.
Right, okay, now I get it.
Right,
Thank
and
you.
because I mean, there's a brilliant quote from Lazzarato in Making the Indebted Man, where he talks about actually after 2008, one of the things is that what we've done is we have assumed this as our individual responsibility, and that we make this our project to pay this off. And what I'm doing is reading. Speculative designers need to fix the system as a form of imagination economy.
Thank you.
Yeah, if that makes sense.
Don't worry, if there's no time, don't worry.
If you want to make a really quick comment, we need to move on.
Or make a really quick thing.
Yeah.
It sort of connects to Michael's. And maybe it's for later. But it seems, I really appreciate what you're doing. And coming from a place where I recognize it, I know how necessary it is. And maybe one of the things we could talk about later is the way that form of speculation presumes a subject doing the work.
Oh yeah.
Whereas Whitehead's form of speculation operates completely differently. So maybe later we could think about this a little bit more, because then that would trouble the neoliberal.
Yeah, right. It's an individual who assumes the responsibility that must then speculate.
Okay, thank you. So move on to Joe Petek.
All right, technical difficulties.
You're not technically fluent.
There we go. So I thought I'd first start with a question or a couple of polls. By a show of hands, how many of you in the past year have watched at least a couple of films? Should be almost everyone, right? Okay, now by a show of hands, how many people in the past year have played at least a couple of video games? It's actually maybe a little more than I thought. But academics tend to play less video games, as far as I can tell. They can't not to be gamers, which makes them a little bit unusual, because actually a lot of people now are.
We don't admit it.
Yeah, but you don't admit it. It's it's considered, I guess, a little embarrassing in academia to be a gamer. But they haven't really paid much attention to video games, perhaps because until recently, the majority of games fell into the category of what I'd call adolescent male power fantasy, involving shooting or fighting things. But video games over the past decade have begun to mature as a medium and are beginning to do far more interesting things than that. But even if that wasn't the case, we have to acknowledge that video games today are a huge cultural force. In fact, the video games industry actually makes more money than either the music or movie industries. And about 60% of Americans today play video games, and fully 50% of households have a dedicated video game console. And with virtual reality headsets being released commercially earlier this year, we're entering a new era for the medium. And we're going to continue to interact more and more in virtual spaces, I'm sure, whether it's online video meetings or augmented reality applications or fully immersive virtual world experiences. So what I want to talk about briefly today is the actual construction of these virtual worlds and what ideas might emerge from it. The question I want to raise is simple and broad. What, if anything, can the construction of virtual worlds tell us about the way our own universe works? I don't believe that there is a wholly necessary connection between the two, but virtual worlds recommend themselves to us as imaginative generalizations because unlike other carefully constructed models and systems of the universe, we don't need to fight over whether a virtual world is correct or reflects the real world, because its virtues, limitations, and flaws are found in our direct experience of it, rather than on our conceptual wrangling over it. Whitehead wrote in Processed in Reality that the true method of discovery is like the flight of an aeroplane. It starts from the ground of particular observation, it makes a flight in the thin air of imaginative generalization, and it again lands for renewed observation rendered acute by rational interpretation. So with this in mind, I want virtual worlds to serve as our imaginative generalizations of the moment. I'm now going to give you a quick crash course in some aspects of virtual world construction, then look at one particularly impressive virtual world, draw some parallels to Whitehead's cosmology, and we'll see what insights might shake loose from this. The first and most important distinction I want to make is between what I'll call traditionally constructed virtual worlds versus procedurally generated ones. A traditional virtual world has each of its pieces created individually within the context of a game engine. An easy analogy is that creating games this way is like painting or sculpting, with each element coded by the artist and added to the larger structure. Procedural generation, however, uses algorithms to create virtual worlds automatically, based on a given formula and given limitations for what the end product will look like. An easy example is the creation of a virtual person. Rather than individually creating a person's features, I might instead create a range of possible values for the computer to choose from at random, and then generate the virtual person on the fly. Such ranges of values might include the rule that the person must be between 4 and 7 feet tall, and have a nose of a certain length, ears of a certain size, skin color within a certain range of pigments, etc. The important thing to remember with procedural generation, though, is that procedurally generated objects themselves don't properly exist within the virtual world's code, only the ranges of values that are possible in generating them. So there's a distinction here between procedural generation and mere randomness. For instance, if I wanted to populate a city in a virtual game world, I might individually craft 100 or so different people, then have the game populate the world with these pre-made models as I move through it, duplicating as necessary to create the illusion of a city full of unique individuals. In this case, the computer would be populating the world randomly, but not procedurally, because those individual models still exist as discrete lines of computer code. With all that understood, let me briefly go over some of the advantages and disadvantages of these two methods. Procedural generation has some key advantages over the more traditional method. Since they don't require the storing of large amounts of individual objects, procedurally generated worlds have smaller file sizes and are able to generate theoretically limitless worlds with unlimited novelty. However, these huge advantages come with some big limitations. First, creators have less control over the end result. If the world isn't coded well, the random choices of values that the computer makes in generating the world may end up making it look like a Frankenstein's monster. Procedural generation also tends to limit interactivity between large numbers of players because players need to be present within the same space in order to interact. And if their various worlds have been randomly procedurally generated in different ways, then they cannot do so. Also, procedurally generated content is typically not persistent, or at least not for very long, meaning that after you view a certain portion of the world and then move on, the computer will dump the old data behind you. If you try to return to an old haunt in these procedurally generated worlds, the computer will simply have created something else. Conversely, a traditionally constructed virtual world gives its creators a high degree of control over the end result, with each element receiving individual attention. It also allows a theoretically limitless number of people to meet up within the world, since they're all traveling in the same virtual space, and the world remains persistent no matter how long you are away from it. However, creating such worlds is time-consuming and resource-intensive. Okay, now the fun part. A video game called No Man's Sky was released this past August for Sony's PlayStation 4 and Microsoft Windows that uses a fairly simple conceit in order to get past some of the limitations of procedural generation and make a virtual world that is both stupendously large and yet persistent and allowing for people within it to interact. In order for you to get an idea of the impressiveness of what No Man's Sky has achieved, let me briefly compare it by the numbers to a much lauded, traditionally constructed game world, that of Grand Theft Auto 5. Talk about adolescent male power fantasies. Grand Theft Auto 5 was developed by roughly 1,500 people over a period of 5 years. Its game world encompasses about 50 square miles, which is an awful lot to handcraft, and has a disk size of about 65 gigabytes. And here we have a shot of the game world so you can have a sense of what it looks like. No Man's Sky was also developed over 5 years, but by a team of only about 10 people. Its universe, however, is many orders of magnitude larger than 50 square miles, as it contains roughly 18 quintillion planets, and has a total file size of only 6 gigabytes. 18 quintillion is number 18 with 18 zeros after it, by the way. The math here is pretty astounding. Even if you were to watch 100 computer monitors simultaneously, each showing a picture of a unique planet from No Man's Sky for only a single second, it would still take nearly 6 billion years to see them all. Long enough for our sun to expand to a red giant and kill everyone on Earth. For the curious, here are a few screenshots of No Man's Sky to quickly look at it. We have 3 of them here. So how did they do it? Well, the insights that the developers had was that a functionally limitless universe could be constructed if they could get the computer to procedurally generate its universe the same way every time. So rather than instructing the computer to pick from among ranges of values at random, it instead picked values on the basis of a seed number, in this case the phone number of one of the developers. The seed number was plugged into an equation in order to define the overall structure of the galaxy, and the random numbers spawned from it served as digital markers for stars. The process was then repeated. Each star's number became a seed that defined its orbiting planets, and the planetary numbers were then used as seeds to define the qualities of planetary terrain, atmosphere, and ecology. In this way, No Man's Sky combines randomness and structure. Since each of the game's players begin with the same seed and same formulas, they experience identical environments. The result is a functionally limitless universe with limitless novelty that is nonetheless persistent and allows interaction between the people who visit it. So how does all of this relate to Whitehead? Or more specifically, why is the virtual universe of No Man's Sky more Whiteheadian in structure than other virtual worlds have been? The first easy and obvious parallel to draw is that the ranges of possible values for procedurally generated objects very much resemble Whitehead's notion of eternal objects, which are pure potentials or possibilities that give form to actual entities. As Whitehead imagined, they are not independently existing platonic forms, but rather a range of possibilities. Another parallel is that objects in No Man's Sky need every other object in the universe in order to exist, which coincides with Whitehead's insistence on the constitutive interrelatedness of things. This is true in a couple of senses. First, since its universe was derived from a seed number plugged into an equation that generated all of its various pieces, the microstructures of the individual flora and fauna were derived from the macrostructure of its planet, solar system, etc. Second, recall that although this universe appears persistent and is persistent in a certain sense, it does not actually exist on the physical media of the game disk. The disk does not contain the universe, but rather the instructions for creating it. The computer only generates the pieces of the world the player can see when they actually travel to or approach these locations. So in a very real sense, this universe does not exist if there is no person actively experiencing it. Another parallel has to do with the role of God in Whitehead's cosmology and the analogous role that the developers of No Man's Sky had in its creation. Whitehead needed God in his system to provide an ordering of possibilities, allowing for novelty and creative transformation, and providing an initial aim for all entities. This is very close to the role of the creators of No Man's Sky. They don't have the power to make small changes to individual entities, but only to change the cosmological laws of the universe as a whole. Return for a moment to traditionally constructed virtual worlds. Creators of these worlds have a supreme degree of control over the details of their appearance and mechanics, precisely because like a painting, their creations are mere appearance. The physics of them is faked or artificial. The stars that appear in the night sky of Grand Theft Auto 5, for example, are not actual stars, merely points of light painted onto a static skybox. Its day-night cycle likewise does not reflect the Earth's rotation, but only that the game's creators programmed the lighting to be brighter or dimmer at specific intervals. In Grand Theft Auto 5, you can walk off the edge of the world and there's nothing there. But changes, then, are simple to make, because changing the number of stars in the sky, for instance, really doesn't affect anything at all other than the appearance of more little points of light. When the virtual gods of No Man's Sky wanted to have the possibility of green skies, the team had to redesign the periodic table to create atmospheric particles that would diffract light at just the right wavelength. And the game's interconnectivity means that every action has a consequence. Minor adjustments to the source code can cause mountains to unexpectedly turn into lakes, species to mutate, or objects to lose the property of collision and plummet to the center of a planet. Something as simple as altering the color of a creature can cause the water level to rise. Aesthetic changes, in other words, are never merely aesthetic, and functional changes are never merely functional. A big hurdle in the game's creation, in fact, was the ability for the creators to be able to see the full implications of their design decisions, so they actually had to create robots that would fly around within their virtual universe and record short videos of an appropriate sample size of random planets, just so they could see that the no levitating rocks or otherwise impossible terrain was popping up. Parallels to Whitehead break down at certain points, of course. While these virtual gods can endow their universe's creatures with an artificial intelligence and desires, for instance, those creatures do not change or evolve. In fact, the entire universe remains static, generated the same way every time it is visited again by the player. If there is a way to program organic change into a virtual world that does not make the data prohibitively large, it has not yet been discovered. And this is the biggest way in which virtual worlds have so far fallen short. We can view them and interact with them, and yet the results of our interactions themselves, such as mining various ores in order to build or power a starship, which is something you can do in the game, do not persist within the world itself. That ore will still be there again when the player next visits, as if it had never been touched. And to name one more major divergence, the virtual gods of No Man's Sky exist outside their creation in a way that Whitehead probably wouldn't have been comfortable with. But this is, of course, an interesting puzzle in itself. It's easy to say that these virtual worlds are not physical in the ways that ours is, and yet the physical laws governing objects within the world itself are consistent and real. The problem comes in the interaction between different realities, and it's a very difficult problem indeed. But I've talked enough, and to return to the original question, what can the construction of virtual worlds tell us about the way our universe works? Welcome to speculation.
Reminds me of that thing Elon Musk said recently about the world that we know is almost certainly a construction of virtual reality, because at the rate at which our capacity to make virtual worlds is advancing, will eventually make worlds so detailed that we will be able to tell, and then the chances are that someone's already done that. Of course, there's a million sci-fi stories based on that.
Yeah.
It ignores a lot of this kind of problem. Right. Any discussion points or questions? I mean, I do have one more. So one of the other things I was thinking about with your analogy about where does God fit in is the second part of God in processing reality, where the world is transformed back into God, or the actual things that perish are transformed back into God and therefore saved, which doesn't happen in this world, in No Man's Sky.
Right.
Although maybe that would be the solution for the designers. If they let the world die in No Man's Sky and then start again every 3 years or something.
That is another interesting metaphor that you can sort of draw, is you can say that the player themselves are the gods who are keeping those changes that do not get to persist within the world itself.
I have a couple desperate thoughts, but so this will take a second. But the first is that in the SenseLab in Montreal, we're up on the 10th floor, and there are huge windows facing this, the south side of the city of Montreal, and beyond the city, mountains in Vermont in the distance. And I had been in the SenseLab facing outwards, looking out those windows during reading groups and classes for months. And one day I noticed that there was a mountain there that had not existed as far as I had perceived it up till that moment. But of course, there is a mountain there. But I wonder if it was really there. So that's one thing. The second is that but between both this presentation and the previous presentation, the role of, and always for me, I always think about science fiction and speculative fiction, and Donna Haraway also reads some of the stingers that came up as there's the sort of fabulatory nature of science fiction. And Ursula Le Guin, who I happen to be reading right now, says that science fiction is not about predicting the future so much as describing the present. So there's another sort of thing. It's like, so just one sentence from this book in this introduction, she's talking about the world I'm describing certain aspects of psychological reality in the novelist's way, which is by inventing elaborate circumstantial lies, such as this space. In reading a novel, any novel, or playing a video game, we have to know perfectly well that the whole thing is nonsense, and then while reading, believe every word of it. So there's a sympathy in playing a video game, in seeing this mountain, in reading science fiction, which is that as it is in front of me, I must believe in it in order to be implicated in its reality. So finally, I'm just pulling these together because I feel like they form a constellation, but maybe they don't. So finally, returning to the Nietzsche that we were reading this morning, of course, perception, that knowing, we all talked about thought and thinking, does not actually happen on the surface of our brain as we're experiencing it. It's almost, there's a mirroring that takes place between somewhere out there and somewhere in here. And I wonder, just to conclude, whether in a case like this video game, which I've heard of and I think is fascinating, is that not an entirely real world? And these like technical problems of not having enough storage space for it, is that not analogous to knowing and to perception, the way that Nietzsche is talking about it, which is this massive flattening out of something? Just because we're not able to perceive it, does it mean that it's not existing when we turn the video game off?
I think that's fantastic. I agree with much everything you said. I also love science fiction. I almost included a short clip from Star Trek. I didn't. And I also do love that kind of suspension of disbelief that happens and letting your mind kind of reset into a different environment and then able to take that back into another space and say, what has this taught me, or how am I thinking differently now? Which is kind of the question that I'm trying to provoke here is, when we go into this new world, what does that maybe tell us after we come back? That's what science fiction does as a whole.
And that's actually the text definition of reality, that which when you stop thinking about it doesn't happen.
I think,
Adam, you were next, and then who was someone else?
I think what's interesting about, I mean, there are many things really interesting about this, is that we can find, and maybe this plays on what I'm trying to say, is that we can find the resources for entertaining speculative propositions in many different kinds of media, right?
Many different kinds of
media. It's not necessarily going to just be our traditional science fiction novel. It might be in a video game, but it also might be in some place completely unexpected. right? And I think that's one of the things that, I mean, this is my sort of, I'm a very serious reader of science fiction and fantasy, and I think that one of the things that aggravates me about it is that when we sort of restrict it to this genre, it's only, or these books are science fiction, these books are fantasy, and we start putting them, classifying them, putting them in the genre. Like, why can't a documentary film be just as much invested in science fiction and propositional and so forth, right? And I think that's one of the questions that design is asking as well, right? So, I don't know really what, I think what's really interesting about this, and what is so interesting about game studies, some of the best people working in game studies, is suggesting really games can do stuff. They're material in this world that can change how we engage with the present. Anyway, that's just my thought.
Yeah, really interesting, Joe. Thanks. It has me thinking a little bit about the relation to sort of potentiality and actuality. Whitehead system is very much about actualizing what can be, in a certain sense, right? We're always being faced with new potentials. But the stubborn fact of life is that sometimes potentials are cut short severely, right, in the actual world. So it just has me thinking at least about sort of the existential impact of being able to have access again, perhaps, to actualizing these virtual possibilities in the mode of playing the game. So I wonder, I guess it's a question of how do we existentially relate when we play the game and are given access again to a world that may have many more potentials than one's actual world does have. So I mean, that could go all over the place, but maybe it's just a general comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. I have a easy question.
Okay. Oh, good.
Would you please go back to the PowerPoint on God, and would you please tell me a little bit more about your understanding of God?
Easy question.
Easy question. I'm sorry, it was supposed to be easy. In relation to the video game.
Well, I mean, James did mention that there is this other purpose to Whitehead's God that I didn't really mention in here, which is that he's trying to preserve change, preserve order amid change, or flux. But the gods of No Man's Sky, or the creators, are basically, they're imbuing their artificial intelligence of their creatures with some initial aim in terms of the behaviors that they want them to enact. But they're also creating God in Whitehead's thought isn't the kind of traditional theist God that can interact with particular instances because he doesn't have a concrete body. He can only change the kind of cosmological laws and order of the universe, the rules of things, in order to maximize creativity and transformation. And that's really what the creators here were trying to do. And they can't just take one individual rock and shift it or change one color of one creature. They have to change the fundamental rules of everything in order to change anything. And I think that's a parallel there. The clip from Star Trek that I didn't end up using was there's this godlike being named Q, for those of you who watch Star Trek, has lost his powers and is on the Enterprise, and they're trying to get this rock, this asteroid, to not crash down onto a planet and kill everyone. And so they're asking Q, well, how do we go about fixing this? Our ship can't pull it away. We don't have enough power. And he said, well, you just change the gravitational constant of the universe. I'm like, well, how do you do that? You just do it. And that's kind of thinking like God. Does that help?
But something that pops up along those lines is, couldn't a sufficiently skillful manipulator manipulate these larger order things to produce particular outcomes, like stopping the one rock in such a way that that limit it maybe through systems of countervailing forces, other undesirable outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, these are just 10 game developers. Presumably, the actual God, if we can talk about that, maybe has more capabilities than they do in terms of, I discussed, for instance, the fact that they had to invent these robots to go around and look at everything to make sure nothing was too screwed up. Whitehead talks about God as having sort of an omniscient perception, so presumably that wasn't something that he was going to run across. So maybe we can talk about God as having more capabilities that way than they have for this game.
Okay, so 2 more quick comments from you and then Roland, and then we'll finish.
I just wondered, Joe, what do you think the title means?
What was my title?
No, the title of the game.
Oh, No Man's Sky. Basically, this game was, it was basically about infinite exploration, and that you can be the one explorer who can find something for the first time, which is something that appeals to a lot of people. And I mean, I could do the math again, but I think no more than 10 million people will ever play this game, and when you divide that into 18 quintillion, they technically programmed in the game the capability for people to interact, but the chances, since everyone, when you split between them, everyone has like 10 trillion planets they can explore, no one's ever actually going to find anyone else. So the funny thing is that they've created this ability for interactivity, and yet there's not enough people there in this universe because they start them all in different places.
But is the gender important?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's with the gender?
I can't speak to that.
What percentage of video game players are women?
Yeah.
I think it's like No Man's
Sorry.
Land, right?
Yeah,
Just playing on No Man's Land.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
In the kind of exploration of places where there is no man.
So for me, it's a many faceted question of meaning that comes up by thinking about that. I just pick one point. If our world would be something like this, I wonder whether we are the better version or whether we have been sold and who bought us. Because the background of the game is still like to be sold, right? And there's not meaning in it per se. And so I wonder about that.
Yeah, that is true. It's a commercial venture, and actually, I mean, what I didn't talk about really, because there wasn't enough time, it wasn't really that important, but this received very tepid critical reception after much excitement, partly because the real novelty and change in it and variation was not as much as it could have been, to the extent that you visit, maybe 50 to 100 of these 18 quintillion planets, and you start seeing the patterns that have been used, the templates, in order to generate these creatures, and maybe they're not as different as we could hope they would be.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Move on to our last So we finish the session with Murphie.
Okay, so everyone imagine the most perfect cup of coffee you've ever had, or cup of tea, or whatever. And imagine having it. You can drink it. I just thought I'd say that. I don't know if it's cruel or kind. Okay, so I've started quite a few of my talks back in the day with a big slide of a herd of wildebeest. And this is a tip, right? And then I would say, this talk is a herd of wildebeest, and it's amazing what you can say after that. You can say anything, right? So that's a professional tip. I'm trying to think what this talk isn't a herd of wildebeest. You were pleased to know. I'm trying to think of the appropriate analogy. I think it's probably a kind of trample through the woods, off the track. And if you're in Australia, you're probably stomping so the snakes will get out of the way. And I guess in Canada, you're singing loudly so the bears won't find you. I think that's what this talk is. I'll see. Okay, so here I'm trying to find a way into asking whether media and communications and related concepts, which I will suggest are driving a lot of what's happening in the world at the moment, like sometimes I would think most, are useful concepts and technical propositions anymore. And I'm asking this precisely knowing that they are at the apparent height of their powers. And the same could be said about a number of other key concepts, ongoing propositions, and the various techniques they bring into play. And I note in passing here that many of Whitehead's concepts, medium itself, in fact, subject and object, society, personal order, etc., are at odds with the same concepts as they are put to work in general culture. So are media, communications, computing, networks, algorithms, etc., useful concepts anymore? Or for that matter, larger concepts like the social, climate change, politics. A lot of concepts that seem so basic to us might in fact be exhausted propositions, or perhaps false unities that cover over an increasingly complex, powerful, and intertwined series of differential multiplicities. That's just the introduction and a short juncture. And this is a juncture concerning vectors. And I'm calling it the Internet of Actual Occasions. Following on from the emerging Internet of Things, if you don't know what that is, I'm not going to tell you. Someone recently proposed an Internet of Nano Things. So this is a massive extension of the Internet. Is this going too far, some ask? And others suggest this isn't going far enough yet. Now, in general, we can, in very different ways, seem to be getting near to the very basis of events in things like the Internet of Nano Things, via techniques, but also, I think, via micropolitics, even via metaphysics. Now, my question to begin with is, what can or should we do in such a situation? Now, this proposition concerns that which has until now been known and thought as media, again, communication, networks, algorithms, and related concepts and techniques. Start with this speculative, pragmatic proposition. Let us assume that we can go as far as possible, let us assume that we can go as far as possible, that an Internet of Actual Occasions is possible. How would it work? Would it be desirable? If we could, should we use it? What difference would it make to think with it, work with it, organise in partnership with it? Do we, in reality, already have it? Is it called the world as medium for the transmission of influences, as discussed by the, I think, quite under-recognised media and communications thinker, Alfred North Whitehead? That I can talk about for hours about that, but I won't. If it's already here, what would its relationship be to the more than human designed techniques that we have? Okay, juncture. Something like media, communications, networks, algorithms, and related concepts and techniques have been at the heart of power during the last 100 years and probably more. They have long produced interventions in worlds that are many and major. And I think a great deal has followed from this, and again, this is under-recognised in philosophy, in education, in management, in politics, in economics, social organisation, and more. Now, the precise workings of these concepts and techniques have always been contested, but the basic existence of the concepts and techniques themselves has seldom been questioned. Thus, they perform a particular and important speculative pragmatics. In mainstream culture, certain versions of these concepts and techniques could now even be said to be protected concepts and techniques. And this protection, I think, is almost of a religious order. And I don't mean that in a good way. Many of these concepts and techniques have become fundamental articles and rituals of a secular faith, by, for example, the Shannon Weaver model of the century, you know, the famous model of communication, or in the rise of cognitivism, in which the brain is like a computer processing symbols and so on. Much of which I think comes out of Principia Mathematica. The culture energised by this faith has been a large factor in what Brian Massumi, I always like saying Brian Massumi when Brian's in the room, right? Brian Massumi has discussed as a becoming environmental of power. And this is in large part via the extension of media and communications into more of world, and in finer gradations of intervention in world into what Brian has called bare activity, or into the like of what Elizabeth Povinelli has called geontology, and more. Now, this is largely an ecologically destructive extension of power. There seems no limit to its appetite. Indeed, if the Internet of Actual Occasions was a real technical possibility, there could be little doubt that it would be quickly colonised as a new site for power. Yet to come back to the initial question, what really are communication, media, computing, networks, algorithms, etc., in all these contexts and in other possible contexts? What are they in concept? What are they as ongoing propositions in varieties of speculative pragmatics, as designed techniques, as themselves imperfect refractions of world? There is another way to think this. There has recently been what we might simply call a return of the world. This is a world beyond, if still at times working within, what Erin calls the more than human. And this world exceeds the reach of even the extended techniques of the human. The return to this world is demanded most obviously by climate change and other environmental challenges, and has always been accepted in process philosophy and other philosophies tending towards the ecological. It is also found more recently, for example, in the increasing acceptance that plants have sophisticated modes of communication, of social networking and action, even thinking, people say. Such a return of the world was also anticipated by Whitehead in his idea of the world as a medium for the transmission of influences, for the vector transmission of feeling. Now, my juncture is this. What is now happening at the juncture between these two? The mediated becoming environmental of power and the world as medium. Or let us move away from the bifurcation of the mediating and the mediated, which becomes in fact a trifurcation in, for example, the Shannon and Weaver model when you have the sender, the messenger and receiver, up to, I think, to something like an n-1ification is going on in the world at the moment. Or to think this, this juncture in unbifurcated terms, what precisely is this juncture itself, where both becoming environmental of power and the world of medium have to be considered at once on the same plane? How might we approach this juncture with the rigour of attention to immanence that it needs, and that Erin's been talking about in the conference so far? Okay, proposition 2 is, what would it mean to think and design media, communication, networks, algorithms, and so on, without a bifurcation of nature? Because I think at the moment, so much of it is designed with very much a bifurcation of nature. And you know what? I think I'm going to finish there, because it seems a good place to finish, and because it's late. And you can have a real coffee.
Great. Perfect timing. Anyone want to start us off? Or carry us on?
Okay, I have a maybe it's a naive question, but so I'm wondering if maybe the question in some ways, and maybe you are asking, maybe I just pick up on this. The question might be reframed in such a way that we should be asking, what does an occasion make matter about media and communication systems? In other words, not to base our thinking of media and communication systems off whether or not these systems are replicating or do replicate occasions, but maybe what do these occasions make matter about them? What can we pay attention to now? I don't know if that would be something you agree with, or.
Yeah, I think it's great about the occasions, because again, that's exactly what I'm trying to bring up. If we actually think to what the occasion actually means as something that can be taken up,
right?
Speculatively and pragmatically, yeah, absolutely. But I don't want to leave media and communications intact.
Yeah.
That would be my problem with that.
Right.
For two reasons. One is I'm after teaching media and communications for decades. I'm not sure that media are media anymore, and I'm not sure that communication is communication. Right. And I've realised I don't even know what communication is, and I don't think many people do. But that's just something. And the other reason I think is that I think, sure, of course, when you say media and communications no longer exist, but we say there's film, there's television, all these kind of things. I kind of get that, but I think a lot of what media and communications departments, a lot of what media and communications, what we used to call those things, the things formerly known as media and communications are doing, is quite different to all those kind of things, and not relatable to a single medium, or a single version of communication. So I'm quite happy to. So that's, the third reason is I want to get away from Shannon and Weaver, which is impossible. Actually, you cannot escape Shannon and Weaver. But one of the many things that Shannon and Weaver do is they suspend what I'm calling simply the imminence of the communicative act, right? So, or the imminence of the communicative event is probably a better way to think about it. So you get the effective communication is always occurring at either end of it, in the before or the after. And I think a lot of where the power is happening, where the actual power is at work, is in the actual imminence of the communicative event. And it seems to me that until we move away from communication as thinking about it, and information and all the related terms in those ways, computation, what is a sign that came up earlier this morning, you know, all those kind of questions and rethink them. But I think the way into rethinking those things, one of those ways might be exactly how you started, to start rethinking, okay, why does an occasion matter? And in a sense, how does it matter, you know, in those ways? Absolutely, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more about the connection you were making with Brian's Their activity?
I guess there was a point about power, and in a sense it's quite similar to trying to think through the power in the imminence of the communicative event, which is to say, where is power right now? How is it being enfolded and unfolded right now between us and in the room, in the kind of differential multiplicity in this room? How is that, you know, where is it now? You know, I mean, Nietzsche, in the Nietzsche readings, has said how power moved from one moment to the next, and this next time is a whole different kind of set of things. So, sorry, what was the question again? I'm very tired.
Their activity.
Their activity, yeah. Okay, so my point there was really that, well, in media there's an idea that, that there was a second enclosure, which was the enclosure of intellectual property, which we've all experienced now. One of the effects of Trump, I'm sorry to mention him, we've mentioned him all day. But one of the effects is an attack on the way that the internet works in a more open kind of way. People are saying that will be one of the things that he could really be very bad with. Yeah. So it seems to me that that's the second enclosure, right? Is to enclose media so we're all regulated in the way that we can interact with media. The first enclosure, of course, is the enclosure of land, which forms property and everything else, blah, blah, blah. I think for a long while now, the aim has been a third enclosure, and that third enclosure is the enclosure of everything. So, and I think it's no smaller than that, you know. So what is everything? Everything is everything, right? So if there's some new thing, let's colonize that. You know, let's turn that into debt and credit. You know, whatever new thing there is, or new event. Sorry, wait. Not a thing. But whatever. So bare activity, great. Let's have a slice of that. You know, you know, geontology, fantastic. Let's get in there. You know, whatever it is that comes up. And in a sense, this is a real trap for metaphysics as much as it is for technology, because it means that we're all here finding lovely ways out of things. And I think a number of people have talked about this. You find a way out of something, you find a new concept. Even degrowth, which I think is a really lovely concept. I'm totally with you on degrowth. But I was thinking, well, you know,
can be
absolutely
enclosed.
Someone or some kind of form of capital is thinking, how can we do that to degrowth? You know, so that's kind of really where I was with bare activity, which Brian, of course, has written about in his own way quite a lot.
So what is it that, in terms of the becoming environmental of power and the internet of actualizations, what is the kind of, is there a kind of a mode of resistance or something in Whitehead that can work in the becoming environmental of power? Like, what does Whitehead
well, the simplest.
Oh, what does
the simplest thing I can do is to refer to Roland, who I think kind of has some of the answer here. In that, I think that if you, I mean, you know, you search for a philosophy and metaphysics that is going to do less harm, let's say, rather than do no harm. And I think you can find it, for me, in terms of media and communications and undoing the damage that media and communications do. I think you can begin to find that in the concept of the world as medium itself, as a kind of concept, and as that becomes a proposition for working and thinking with concepts around media communications and computing and so on, and the techniques differently. So, and the main thing there is I guess, you don't have to take over the world. You know, it's already doing it. You know, so we come back to the question of the subject and the predicate and all kinds of stuff. You know, so for me, there is something in the whole idea of the world as a transmission, you know, vectors for feeling and so on, which allows you to relax, so put it that way, about, you know, to put down your phone, your iPad, your computer and everything else, and sort of say, well, actually, you know, things are already happening. I don't have to mediate and communicate everything to make something happen. You know, and I think there's probably a lesson in academic practice in that, and in education, that we're always communicating more and more, adding more media, going online, and then blending online and offline, and all this kind of stuff. And I feel like saying, well, actually, it's already happening. Relation is already happening in these situations already, and often when you add a whole lot of becoming environmental of power kind of things, you know, into these situations, it destroys, I guess we might call the ecology that was already there and already occurring. So it's a kind of ecological point, yeah.
Well, sorry, last.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, did you? So I'm just, so there have been sort of Whiteheadian arguments for media studies. I'm thinking of like Luciana Parisi.
Yeah.
Right? And sort of the way she, I mean, I love Luciana, but the way she sort of fetishizes computing and mathematics. And, you know.
Why do we always say we love her before we say that?
Yeah, I know. but that something like uncertainty and incomputability are intrinsic to computing, right? And that we need to retain this understanding of computing precisely because we can think these very Whiteheadian notions through a really, really sophisticated understanding of, I mean, her arguments through architecture. Right?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how you would situate something like this, which is a very strong argument.
Well, I mean, you know, first I have to understand her arguments. I mean, we did have a reading group on that book. It was fantastic, actually.
Yeah.
And I do really love that book. But we spent the whole time reading it and saying, we think we get it. This was with a bunch of really smart people, you know, like postgrads and people who are really smart. You know? And did we get it? Did we get that? You know? And I mean, I know Luciana a little bit, so one day I'm going to ask her and say, Luciana, did we get it? You know, but look, I think there's a really complex point in there, which is whether you agree with it or not. I think Luciana in that book is opening up computing to be something other than it is usually conceived to be, and I think that's a really important. So, you know, algorithms having computability at their heart. Most people go, "What are you talking about? You know, they're predictable, right?" And you know, infinite data sets disrupt everything. You know, that kind of stuff I think is really quite disruptive. Although it does connect really well to the actual history of thinking, computing, and developing computing, and Turing, and in fact Whitehead. You know, so if you go back to Mathematica, right, which I haven't read and will never read, I can promise you. But you know, but look at the history of that, and who took that up? Who took that up? It was Norbert Wiener. I think Claude Shannon worked with Russell for a while. Herbert Simon. You know, there's a whole. We just go through them all, and you're looking at the history of media studies. McLuhan just rips, like everyone, he rips everyone off, but he certainly rips Whitehead off on his main points. You know, the different ratios of the sensors is totally in Whitehead in more detail than it is in McLuhan, for example. So what you see is a kind of actual history of thinking, I guess, by some of the more innovators in thinking and working with computing that Luciana is repeating, because they all figured out very long time ago, including Whitehead, that you try to make a closed system and it just doesn't work because of these kind of things. So there's a kind of weird counter history of media communications and computing that's also the actual central history. And once you look at that, you see Whitehead everywhere, actually, which is interesting. So that's a kind of complicated answer to that question, I think. But that point, I don't know if returning to that more hidden yet more central history, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. That's the question for me at that point. But I certainly want to get rid of the mainstream understanding of computing and media as these kind of smooth, functional, whatever things. Yeah.
I happen to work in an office directly above Luciana Parisi.
Oh,
and I don't know if she fetishizes computing, but she definitely shouts at her computer. So I can tell you that.
There you have the perfect.
Erin.
Is there still time?
Yeah, there's still time. We're going 10 minutes over.
Send her something through the floor. We miss her.
That's right.
Yeah, Andrew, I love these junctures, and there's so many different ways that I want to think about it, but I don't think we have time right now. One of them has to do with the work we're doing on cryptocurrencies and the complexity of the programming language in relation to creating a world as medium. But because I can't think that yet, and I'm not going to force you on 2 days of not sleep to think it. I'm just going to make a comment. Maybe you have some thoughts about it. I've been in the back of my head all day, as I think you know, is a report that I received this morning. Unfortunately, I woke up early and I checked my email. It's a bad idea to do. And I mentioned yesterday that we'd written a big grant, which is really, if I could rename it now, would have been called The World is Medium. So we wrote a partnership grant in Canada. It's the biggest grant you can get on Whitehead. And we called it immediation. And we've asked a lot of people over the years to tell us what immediation might mean. And Andrew answered, the world is medium. And we thought, of course, there we can go. So today I received a report which was very unenthusiastic. Which is not super surprising. I mean, we did have 278 events in 3 years, so I thought we'd get a little pat on the back. But one of the things that they left me with, which is very juncturing in relation to what you're saying, is that they said they couldn't find evidence of a network. We work in 4 continents with events happening all the time. And so I kept thinking, what is the image of the network that they're looking for? And I think this gets to the real heart of what you're saying. Because if you really take Whitehead seriously, you're not performing your positioning, you're doing the work. And there, because you're not performing it that way, you're not speaking from the position of, I represent Brazil, or I represent Australia. And then what happens is that there is no value added. And so what they say to me, unfortunately, I'm sad to tell you, is that we don't have a social media presence. And so, so if we had a social media presence, they would be recognizing our capacity to network. So anyway, I'm just saying that to depress you and to really, you know, I think that the work you're doing is so important, and I know what the cost is, because although we did get the funding, the money that 32 people live on and eat with, so many of us are exhausted by the systems that make us have to work in them, and including yours. So.
I mean, there's so much you could say to that. I'm sure lots of people would say lots here, but I mean, the little answer is I don't think universities get media or communication, and they certainly never got computing. They don't get networks. They hate social media, actually, in reality, and they don't get what's coming and already arriving now in terms of machine learning and artificial intelligence and everything else. They just cannot go there. Ironically, because they invent a lot of these technologies, right? But as institutions, no. And the question, and I give them 5 to 10 years because of that mainly. But why is that? And I think it's the answer, the really huge, big answer, this is the really, really big answer, is I'm trying to think at the moment, like I was thinking about economy before. It was very interesting, Barbara, when you talk about economy, and I'm thinking a lot of the economy, the idea of economy that we have is based on like 10, whatever it is, 12,000 years of stable climate, right? You know, and I mean, and I think Anna Singh's been writing interesting stuff on the history of crops and all that kind of stuff, and mushrooms. That is really interesting in relation to that. I'm thinking, well, and it's not just that. It's like if you've had the stable climate's guaranteed economy, the development of most of our ideas and concepts and disciplines and fields and practices and everything else. And so the climate is now going like that. But it's not only the climate. Social stuff is happening like that as well. You know, and I think the things formerly known as media and communications are also doing that. You know, everyone's saying artificial intelligence and robots, which I regard as post-media technologies, are destroying workplaces. And everyone, some people say it's going to be the physical work, some people say it's going to be the more expertise-based work. You know, it sounds like most things. You know. There's a whole range of things that are shifting like that. So we've got these triple and more. We've got these triple massive changes happening at once. And my simple question to myself at the moment that I can't answer for you is, what does it feel like to be in that? You know, and that's such a hard question for all of us. I'm thinking, well, one of the answers is, I don't want to know. I don't want to know what a network is really. I want you to have something that shows me that you're doing these things without actually having to deal with the world as medium itself, where this stuff is really happening. And I think that what we see is a lot of reaction, and in some ways, although it's tempting to say how terrible these reactions are, you can completely understand it because we all do it as well. You know, we're very attached to these things, but they're all disappearing very rapidly. I mean, because at the same time as all the changes are happening, we're getting this massive compression that we know about of the past, which we used to be able to think, well, we can deal with the past in our own good time. And also we used to think about the same about the future. We'll deal with the future, you know, in a while, and we'll work slowly on this. I mean, one of the few good things about He Who Won't Be Named Again is that suddenly everyone's saying that won't work anymore. So we have to do it now, and we have to get organised and so on. And I think, so that compression happens at the same time, but I mean, these are multipliers for our difficulties. They're not simplifiers, you know. And I think, you know, the kind of work done here today has really been really interesting for me. The number of directions that are posing some of the speculative propositions that allow us to even enter into those situations or questions, you know. I mean, to look for peace, for example, seems to be a pretty important thing, you know. So yeah, and the university, I just think, to be honest, it's really annoying. And we talked about this many times, but they're just lost, actually. Sorry, apologies to anyone. But it just feels to me like it's just totally lost. You know, it's just like, so we'll just do this because that's all we can do.
Where could you go from there?
Yes, it's like a great place to finish.